Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Alex Alexandrou from the Football and War Network. Alex, how you doing? Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Rory. I'm looking forward to this morning's conversation. I obviously listen to your podcast, and what I like about your podcast is there's a lot of overlap with the work we do with the Football and War Network. So hoping to pick up on some of the themes that you've been developing over the last few weeks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been chatting for quite some time now, and we've had a couple of phone calls just kind of discussing ideas and how we can use both our projects and kind of come together to deliver some things that haven't really been done within the communities and the spheres that we operate in at the moment. But just like you've said there, it's interesting because, obviously in this show, if any of our listeners will have picked up on it, I'm always mentioning that there are always these kind of undercurrents that underpin all of the themes and episodes and football clubs and people that we talk about. And more often than not, they are political issues, they're socio-economic issues, there are issues around identity and heritage. And that's the point of the podcast, to point to these different things and pull out the different themes that we found throughout football. But one thing that I realised when I was planning for this episode is one of the things that underpins almost all of the subjects that we've discussed so far has been war and conflict. And it's not something that really clicked in my mind, first of all, but, it can all be traced back to different kinds of things, whether football clubs were founded, because of a conflict or someone who was involved in a conflict, or, the role that football clubs played within different wars and conflicts as well, which is huge. And that's what we're really going to be diving into today is, football in war and conflict, the role that it plays, and how football and war and conflict really interact with each other, because it's a really, really interesting subject. And what I'm quite keen to explore, and, we will probably explore this in another episode anyway, is that football and war exists so much more out with just World War I and II. So I'm quite keen to dive into these different themes and see, where football has cropped up within different conflicts around the world. But before we get stuck into things properly, Alex, if you just want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, first of all.
Okay then, I'm a historian and a freelance academic. I've worked in football in many different guises over the years. I was part of a fans' takeover of a football club, Dunstable Town.
Wow.
Yeah, and we saved it from going bust. That was about 6-7 years ago now.
Nice one.
And I've also worked with Solihull Moors, particularly around the women's football team there as well. And I was involved with the Kick It Out campaign in its early days in terms of kicking football out of racism, working with the Professional Footballers Association. And I'm currently the project manager of the Army Football Association's football history heritage project, working quite closely with the National Army Museum in terms of the Army FA's collection of documents, diaries, artifacts, trophies, which we hope will go on show in years to come as well. Obviously, I'm the co-founder and chair of the Football and War Network. We set that up in 2015 and officially launched it in 2016. And our base and platform are at the University of Wolverhampton.
Brilliant. Busy man.
Indeed,
to say the least. There's a wealth of experience as well, though. I really, really want to dig into how you saved Dunstable Town and go through some of your other work with football clubs. That can be a topic for another time, though. That's fascinating. And dealing with all those army collections must be really fascinating as well. I mean, there's a lot to be said. We've done an episode on programmes and collecting this year. And there's been a couple other times in episodes we've mentioned collecting memorabilia. But actually working with those documents firsthand, the diaries especially, is absolutely incredible, and you must be able to pull so much from it as well. And that's kind of the purpose of the Football and War Network, which, if any of our listeners aren't aware, are on X and other social media platforms, effectively researching everything surrounding the subject of football and war and the relationship between football and war. So I suppose the first thing in my mind that I wanted to ask you is, the Football and War Network just about World War I and II, or can it be any conflict, or are those just the two wars that you find yourself dealing with the most?
No, it's really wide-ranging. we really start from the Boer War. So we're really looking late 1800s into the first part of the 20th century. Obviously, we look at the First World War, we look at the Second World War, but there are significant other periods as well. The 1930s, particularly with the Nazi regime in Germany, the fascist regime in Italy, and also Franco's regime in Spain. Football, war, conflict was a significant factor in those regimes. We then look to the Second World War, and again, very significant there. But post Second World War, we've got national service from not long after the Second World War right up to 1963. But there have been conflicts since then and military dictatorships. We've looked at South America and how the Argentinian junta utilized football, the famous World Cup from 1978. Even if you think about the Brazilian military junta, would the great Brazilian side of 1970 have won the World Cup without their assistance? You know, the amount of assistance that regime gave that team. And then we come on to, modern day issues. Afghanistan, we've seen how post-Taliban, and I was actually working in Afghanistan in the post-Taliban period. I saw the resurrection of football through the help of the British Army and other institutions. Actually watched football matches, their equivalent of the FA Cup, in the national stadium that was used by the Taliban to actually execute their opponents. And then we look at the Yugoslav war, civil war. We've even now got the conflicts, Ukraine and Russia, that has a significant football dimension to it. And, Gaza, Israel as well, from both sides. You see that, on the one hand, that a thriving football league in Gaza no longer operates. You had Aberdeen's winner in the semi-final was scored by a Palestinian. Yeah, indeed, but that has significant resonance. You've got Israeli teams having to play their European Cup competition matches in countries like Hungary. The Israeli national team has to play away from there as well. And interestingly, if you think about it, it's quite perverse that they're playing home games in Hungary when there were the pogroms against the Jewish populations in the early part of the 20th century. So we cover the whole gambit. There's no conflict that doesn't have a football element to it that we found.
I'd completely agree with you as well. It's funny because, when I first started operating within these kind of circles, shall we say, within X in this community, was obviously coming into it quite fresh. And obviously what I thought to myself was, at that time, it surprised me how much football cropped up in almost everything. Whereas, now a few years on, I'm like, well, yeah, it does, because these are the reasons why. And it is amazing how much football plays a role, and plays a very active role, in conflict and war, but also the aftermath, such as peacemaking. And reconciliation projects and things like that. And those are really the things and the examples that we're going to be diving into today. And I suppose it kind of goes in two ways. It's not really just one dimensional as well, because of course the first thing that came to my mind was a lot of the very early football clubs in Scotland were born from army regiments. So for example, the most prominent example, probably 3rd Lanark, who originally were the 3rd Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers based in the south side of Glasgow. But you also had the 1st Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers, the Renfrewshire Rifle Volunteers. One of the very first football matches played on the island of Ireland was against a regiment from the Scottish Black Watch. Do you know what I mean? So war has always played a part in football, as has conflict, whether it's active war or it's, army regiments going over. But of course, and again, using the example of Ireland, a Scottish Black Watch regiment playing a team in Ireland there's so much you can unpack just from that one sentence. There's so much you can look into. And again, it comes back to this idea that football is a great way to study and research society, because in one football match, you can have so many political connotations, so much history in one game, and you can dig out so much from it. And this is what's really interesting about war and conflict and the role football has played in it. And, I think this is what the Football and War Network is really trying to promote. And to us, it is obvious, but people might not realise it. But, the role and impact of football during war has been significant across different conflicts through the years, hasn't it?
It has indeed. Let me take you back to the Boer War. In one aspect, that was the beginning of particularly the British Army leadership being told that their soldiers were not fit enough. That conflict, the Boer War conflict, really identified gaps and limitations, and they realized that they had to improve the diet of their soldiers. They had to improve their fitness of their soldiers, and football came into play, as well as rugby and other sports.
Yep.
But improving the diet, improving their fitness through football, comradeship, leadership, all began to come into play. We get to the First World War, and football is, first of all, a great equalizer, because footballers, along with every other male, either voluntarily joined up or were conscripted. You were not as a footballer exempt from joining up and fighting. And I think that is quite important, because what you see there is that ordinary mortals were actually fighting and serving alongside their heroes, not only on the home front, but on the Western Front as well. What else you see is that football becomes political, because at first you volunteered to fight in the First World War. You were not conscripted. And there was the media, and particularly the newspapers, were quite nasty towards footballers, because the 1914-15 season continued. The football authorities and the chairman of the football clubs decided that football needed to continue. What people don't realize is that footballers were under contract. They couldn't just walk out of a contract. They'd be breaking their contract of employment. So they were in a catch-22 situation. But on the other hand, the conflict wasn't getting into its brutal stages, let's say, by that point. We had a bit of a phony war for a little while. So you've then got the media attacking footballers for not joining up. But then you've got the authorities and others using football to get people to join up. You've got, footballers being encouraged to join up. So you get the POWs battalion, you've got Heart of Midlothian, who, become part of McRae's battalion. You've got Clapton Orient, who become part of the footballers battalion, the Middlesex, and so on. They're then used as recruitment tools. They're used as propaganda tools. You look at a lot of the propaganda posters that were football related. There are slight digs at footballers. Are you going to join up, and so on. So football becomes it becomes a political football in that sense. And then you've got big recruitment campaigns at stadiums. Maybe before matches, you've got the big speeches saying, "Come and join up," and then you've got footballers saying, "After this match, we're going to join up," in quite simplistic terms. So then they're used as recruiting tools. But then football does stop in the 15-16 season, but football doesn't stop being played. What happens is that professional football stops, but those teams that are professional continue to start playing, because the other aspect we've got to look at here is the morale of the populace.
Correct.
They need an outlet. They thought, oh, we're going to bash the bush and be home by Christmas. Those were the phrases being used. But it wasn't happening. 1914 goes into 1915. 1915 goes into 1916, and so on. And we then got, that's the issue there. They're then fighting alongside and dying. We've got the famous players such as Donald Simpson Bell, Lee Rouse, Walter Tull, and so on. And so you're getting your icons who are sacrificing their lives. But football plays a key part on the home front. It's all regionalised. You get leagues that cover a number of the Lancashire teams and so on. But then football plays a significant part in the morale of soldiers behind the lines because there's lots of football competitions. We've got the great footballer Tim Coleman, who is part of one of the army teams that are playing in a cup competition. And he, ex-Woolwich Arsenal, and he plays in his battalion team, and they beat the Royal Garrison Artillery 11-0 in the final. So if you could get a few professional footballers, you're winning cups and medals. And in the Army FA's collection, we've come across medals from Army Cup competitions being played behind the lines. So for morale purposes, not only playing, but watching as well. Then there is a third element. You have women playing football. You have the munitionettes teams and other teams. For example, my good colleague Steve Bolton has done a lot of work, particularly around the Sterling Ladies. And, these teams will be set up for, a couple of years during the latter part of the First World War. They'll be raising money for charity. In today's money, they raise millions upon millions of pounds, but their crowds were significant. There was one crowd at Goodison, which was in the region of 43,000, but they'd regularly get, a lot. But bizarrely, or not bizarrely, the FA in their wisdom saw fit to ban women in 1921 from playing football. The ban lasted until 1971. So that's one of the things we've developed is women's football. That they weren't allowed to play on FA registered grounds, but football still continued. But what people don't know, and what my colleague Steve Bolton highlights, is that there was another ban in 1902, which was never rescinded. But for the morale of the populace, the FA turned a blind eye to that and allowed them to play football. And they played to a good standard. Obviously you've got the Dick Kerr ladies who are always mentioned, but there were about 250 other women's teams that played well over 1,000 matches. So we are talking, this was a serious type of football being played. So as you can see, football was quite complex in the First World War and in the post-World War I period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one for World War I that I come back to, and it kind of ties into this idea of, the potential for research and football having this really kind of strong heritage that's not often talked about of being, contributing in the wider sense to society and doing things for charity and doing things for the communities, etc., etc. Because during World War I, you also had Rutherglen ladies who are based in Rutherglen, which is it's technically South Lanarkshire, but it's like basically a kind of a suburb of Glasgow. And they played during World War I while the men were off fighting. They raised huge amounts of money for charity within the communities, but also they were attracting gates of between 10 and 20,000 per match, which was significant for any women's team. And Rutherglen ladies also went on to beat Dick Kerr ladies, which is something I always like to mention because, Dick Kerr ladies were all conquering, they were the best team from down south and all that. But there were so many women's teams that really stepped up during World War I, not just to fill that gap, but actually provide a really, really great form of entertainment, as you say, to keep morale high, to raise money. And the fact that they were just then banned from playing a game, it's horrible to think about. Like, it's such a slap in the face. But like the story of Rutherglen ladies, like part of their legacy, and one of the biggest parts of their legacy, I would argue, is their work during World War I, because the men were off fighting, and this is the thing, it's quite hard for people from my generation to really understand, I think, because they're like, well, there must have been some men still around in the communities, and it's like, well, very, very little, to be honest with you, because they were all off fighting, which is why you had so many women's football teams that had to then, be the people who provided that entertainment and fill that void. So it's really fascinating how these different themes always crop up through football throughout history, and it continues to repeat itself in really different ways. Obviously, war and conflict is horrible, and all we can hope for is peace. But at the same time, when you look at football during different conflicts, the same themes and the same kind of topics and activities and events that it would host keep cropping up during it.
They do indeed, but I think what we saw during World War I, because remember during that early part of the 20th century, we had the suffragettes movement, fighting for greater equality for women. But what we see is that women prove that they are equal to men in many different ways. The men go off to fight in the front lines, but who's working in the munitions factories? Who's taking over the men's jobs? We then get a change in society, in that women are now doing the work of men and proving themselves that they can do it without all these, stereotypical negatives around such work. Not only are they working in the factories, they can be working 12 hours plus, but they then go and play football on top of that. So they're not only, and they're looking after their families, they're looking after their children, they're looking after their homes, but they're also playing football as well. And not only, but they're playing football to a high level as well. And that is quite significant. And this is important to understand, is that through football, through war and conflict, you begin to see changes in society, whether it's the role of women or even the role of those who are put into certain classes within society, the working class, the middle class, the upper class as well. You see changes in the societal strata in terms of what people are expected to do and what they then begin to do as well. So, football has a massive impact on both conflict, but also societal changes as well.
100%. And you mentioned it right at the beginning there. This wasn't just something that was confined to World War One and World War Two on the home front. You look at South America, you've got Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile, for example, and the protests surrounding, particularly in Scotland, surrounding the Scottish national team playing in the stadium, like the stadium in Afghanistan where executions were taking place. Obviously, Scotland at home, there was a plant in East Kilbride which opposed Pinochet's regime. It was a Rolls-Royce plant. They were making parts to send to his planes. They boycotted making the parts, and there was this huge protest around it. And then the Scottish national team went to play in the stadium. But you've also got it in Southeast Asia. You've got it in Russia. You've got it in North America. It does happen all over the world, and it's not just confined to World War One and Two. And that's what I find really interesting, and that's what I find brilliant about the Football and War Network, is that you're also looking at other conflicts around the world. And that's not to say that there aren't other people who don't do that. I don't want to discredit them and their work, but I do feel for a very, very long time, everything was very World War centric around studying football. Do you know what I mean? And it led to there being this kind of saturation within it. So by looking at other conflicts, I feel like we can pull so much more out of these topics.
Absolutely. And this was one of the reasons myself and my co-founder, Professor Gary Sheffield, eminent international military historian, set up the Football and War work. What we were identifying, there was lots of research being undertaken by lots of different individuals that wasn't just confined to the First World War, wasn't confined to the Second World War. We were identifying that there were other conflicts where not only we had an interest in, but others had an interest in. And obviously, as part of our the work we do, we run a significant number of seminars every year. We're up to about 30 since we started. And these seminars, they happen, the early ones started at the university, but then we decided to take them on the road and go to different football clubs. And we were not specific about the clubs that we wanted to work with. We'll work with anybody. So we work with non-league clubs. We'll work with football league clubs, Premiership clubs now. And they all look at different aspects of history. And for example, we've worked with Maidenhead United. And not only have they covered the First World War, the Second World War, but also the Falklands War, because one of their people fought in the Falkland War and subsequently lost their life as well. So for me, we had to get away from the First World War and the Christmas truce. The other thing that is important about the Football and War Network is that, it's based on the research undertaken that has been thorough, and that can be, identified as speaking the truth, so to speak. So one of the issues we deal with, and it's a contentious one, is the Christmas truce. And we've got a good colleague, Taff Gillingham, who has given talks around the Christmas truce. There are a lot of fallacies around that. People keep using photographs from a football match being played by soldiers in Salonika in 1915, whereas the truth is, as Taff has pointed out, it depending where you were on the front line at Christmas time, either some parts of it were still taking pot shots at each other, or others there was a truce. They may have met up and talked, but there was no organised game of football. The two instances of football that happened were one in a small village in Belgium and one in a small village in France. And these were like 4 or 5, 6-a-side kickabouts. They put their jackets down, they kicked it, and then basically went back to their positions. And the next day they were taking pot shots at each other again. Part of our remit is to actually not only to bring to life what actually happened with footballers and those connected with clubs in terms of their participation and their actions in regard whatever conflict it is, but also to highlight what the fallacies are and what the truth is. Because you can't have generations of young people believing that there was this mystical match that took place. Yes, there was football a lot of football was played on both sides, but you've got to see what type of football it was and who was engaged in it. And that it's important. And not only do we run the seminars, but we also have an active blog series. We've got nearly 150 blog articles since we started. That's since about 2017. So we regularly, every month, we post at least one blog article, and it covers all types of subjects. Some of them can be quite obtuse. There may be a little connection to football and war, but like as you highlighted earlier, there are societal issues that we can deal with there as well. And I'll give you another example of how we've dealt with certain issues. Recently, Chris Lee gave a presentation at Dulwich Hamlet. Dulwich Hamlet, we've worked very closely with that football club, with their club historians, and Chris Lee launched his third book, which is based around ground hopping around the island of Ireland. But he did deal with the issues of from the Irish Civil War to the troubles in Northern Ireland. He said that there are links. You can't get away with it. There is aspects of war and conflict in football within the island of Ireland, be it within Northern Ireland or the Republic. And again, it was fascinating to listen to the questions afterwards, because there were a number of people who came who were unaware of certain aspects of football in Ireland. Particularly the political aspects, the military aspects, the conflict aspects, particularly civil war, but also the nuances of football in Northern Ireland as well. So, yeah. And again, we are helping to educate people. People learn when they come to our seminars. They're not being taught to in an academic way at all. Our network is open to everybody. So anybody who wants to write a blog article, they can. We've had a number of people who have gone up into their loft, have discovered either their father's or grandfather's war records, but also found hundreds of photographs of them playing football, and they've basically documented their footballing life during their service in the military, and they've written blog articles, and it's fantastic.
I love that. It's like a modern day diary, like going back and seeing all these old things and then putting it into a modern context, obviously by blogging. I really like that. And I'd urge any of our listeners to go and have a look at the blogs as well, or indeed write one for the Football and War Network if that's your bag. And, just to go back to what you mentioned about Chris Lee's latest book, Shades of Green, obviously we recorded and released that episode with Chris a couple of weeks back now. I can't remember if I said it in that episode or if I said to him off air, but what I like about Chris's work is that it's not just a ground hopping like play by play. It's not just I went here and I saw this and this was the result and then I went back to the hotel or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It's a proper like, this is the history of the area. This is why it is today. This is what happened during the Troubles. This is what happened during the War of Independence. And it is fascinating because, and as I did say this during the episode, everything about football in Ireland is political in some way or another. It just is, and that just is what it is. Do you know what I mean? And what was important for me about Chris's work is that, like you said, it's about educating people and about telling them, because people can really enrich their experience of watching football and just generally existing through knowing where they came from, where their football clubs come from, and what they've been through. And I think that's something special that the Football and War Network does, as well as it's educating people and teaching people about their past, their place, and the place that their football club played within the community. And what's quite interesting was I was looking at just quickly at the list of episodes that we've released. I mean, we're going back to we're going back to like summer 2023 now. Like, it's a while back. And just off the top of my head, so Dukla Prague obviously formed from an army organisation. You've got Apop Kinaras from Cyprus. There was issues with their ultras. Obviously, Cyprus, incredibly political when it comes to football as well. You have Ayak Athens, who were formed by migrants from Constantinople, who then settled back in Greece when there was the Greek-Turkish War. You've got Eugenka Krakow, who were eradicated because of the Nazi pogroms against Jewish people in World War II. I mean, Aldershot obviously formed from an army regiment. I mean, that's just the episodes that we released in 2023. But I mean, you know, just looking through them, all of these clubs took part in a war, some way or another. The Italian clubs, Serie A during that time under Mussolini. Yeah, it's everywhere. You know, obviously Athletic Bilbao. It's just it crops up absolutely everywhere.
And it does, and we support, you know, colleagues who have written books that are linked. You know, we've had Chris Lee, Chris Evans as well with the Athletic Club Bilbao. Wonderful history of the book, but he talked to me while researching that book about the Spanish Civil War. Yeah. And you still get that now. But again, one of the things we try to do with the Spanish Civil War is say it's not black and white. It's not Barcelona, Republicans, Real Madrid nationalists. Because if Correct. You think about it, the Republicans were very strong in Madrid for a significant part of that era. That was that led to the Spanish Civil War and then led to Franco afterwards. But also Italy as well, even to this day. Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Israel. There's lots of politics linked to supporting a club, but they do have their grounding in some form of conflict, whether it's a civil war, whether it's a major war. And you need to bring these out because supporting a football club is very complex. It is. There are societal aspects to it. There are family aspects to it. There are community aspects to it. There are political aspects to it. There are definitely war aspects to it as well. And, people, like you say, people either use football as a tool during conflict, but also afterwards as well. Either, you look at a number of the military dictatorships, Franco, the Argentinian one, football was a major propaganda tool, to basically try and convince not only those internally, but those externally that their regimes were a force for good. But that's the reality. They used it to mask what they were doing at times.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there about the different nations and the different conflicts that have risen up in North Africa is a particular area of interest for me. Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, particularly during that colonial era, where especially in Morocco, France, and Tunisia, France would use football as a tool to nation build. Again, I've mentioned that a couple of times on the show, just that particular area of interest of mine, and it's important to remember that again, coming back to this idea of underlying themes, right, through every episode we've released this year so far, there has started developing this underlying idea of power and the relationship between power and football, especially with the episode with Ronnie Blaschke, the episode with James Montague, the episode with Chris as well. And it's fascinating that this is what's kind of happened almost by default, and it comes back to what we said at the beginning, that these themes tend to crop up in football, not just whether we like it or not, but they just tend to crop up because they've come from some kind of conflict. And what is fascinating for me about North Africa, particularly in Egypt, is the roles that ultras groups played within the revolutions and the Arab Spring. In that, within these oppressive regimes, they were the only organised groups of people who had any experience with fighting the authoritarian police forces. And so when revolution kicked off, they were the only people, they were the best equipped people to actually show protesters how to protest. It's really, really fascinating for me, and it's just such a fascinating subject area. And I think this is what is interesting about it coming into the modern era. Whereas we look back at, for example, the Boer War and the First World War, the Second World War, and to an extent, well, the Falklands War is more modern than those wars, obviously, but when we're looking back and we look at these wars, everything, especially when we're getting taught it in school, does get put into a bit more of a black and white sort of, World War One and World War Two. To an extent, it is a bit easier to do that, and I can understand because, for the different reasons that people were fighting. But as we've kind of come into the modern era, wars are a lot muddier, they're a lot murkier, and football plays a completely different role than just being on the home front. But like you've said there, within these regimes, football is a great tool to sports wash things, and we saw that a lot over the last couple of decades, particularly, with Saudi Arabia, with the regimes in Egypt, with the regimes in Turkey as well, because these people know that football and the power that football supporters hold is significant. It's dangerous to them, and they know how much it can threaten their power, so they use it for themselves.
But the precedent for that was back in the 1930s. Both Mussolini and Hitler and their regimes recognized they weren't great football fans, either of them, but they saw the power of football. They saw the power of how they could use it as a propaganda tool, but also to control the populace. So hence, particularly, you look at Italy, you look at local fascist leaders, they will take over the local football team. Bologna is a really interesting one. That was taken over by the local fascist leader. Bologna became not only one of the top teams in Italy, but will be winning, European tournaments, not as we know them now, but there were tournaments in those days. And Mussolini used the 34 and 38 World Cups, significantly. Italy won both of those. Whether they won them fairly and squarely is always a matter of conjecture, but they won them.
Yeah.
But that's the template. Let's move forward. And every time you see, as you've highlighted, a revolution or a civil war or some form of major political takeover that is not democratic, the ultras and other sets of football fans will be utilized. We saw that quite significantly during the Yugoslav civil war, particularly in Croatia and Serbia, where their football firms, if we can call them, a lot of them volunteered to fight. They were significant fighting units, but even after the countries gained their own independence, they still play a key role within politics and within football now. You get the same in Turkey, in Greece, in Cyprus. Supporting a football team is also stating 99% of the time your political affiliation.
I would agree.
And again, but interestingly, what we see is, why did football take such a hold? Let's have a look at the what was the British Empire then. Football was played in the garrisons. Yeah?
Yep.
British Army football, and they'd play local teams as well. Through this Army FA Heritage Project, we've been picking up programs that weren't in our collection, particularly from the 1930s, 40s, and we've got programs from Palestine, from Egypt, from over in India and elsewhere, wherever British troops were stationed or British military personnel, that's RAF, as well as the Royal Navy. They were always playing football. Malaysia as well. we've picked up programs and other artifacts from around the world, and without doubt, the seeds of football were laid, I would argue, a lot of the time, not only by, early merchants who went over. You've got, Russia is another example where the British had a significant impact on the early days of Russian football. But they've laid the seeds. It's been picked up by the local populace, who then, it becomes tribal. It's always been tribal in England, France, Germany, and where have you. But it's become tribal throughout. You support your local team. The owner or those who run the club may have certain political affiliations, and they are used all the time. And I think, as you highlighted, certain regimes now go straight to certain football clubs and certain ultras groups because they can rely on them. And I think you've got another good example, I would argue, is Hungary, where that's happening now as well. So, football is embedded not only from a societal perspective, but a political and conflict. And conflict, you can't just see that as just war. There are nuances to conflict as well. And again, we highlight those in some of the work we do as well.
That's really interesting. And I quite like that as a concept. That, again, it's interesting because the concept of conflict is developing all the time, and especially in the 21st century, where the last 20 years I felt like a bit of a whirlwind in terms of how we define conflict, how we look at things. We've got this idea of like a culture war now. I don't want to lean too much into it because I personally think that the idea of a culture war is a lot of nonsense, but it's an important term that's used, and it's important for me anyway to discuss why it's a lot of nonsense. But it's to kind of get back to this idea that conflict is changing, how we see conflict is changing, and that will manifest itself ultimately on the terraces. And I like this idea that you said as well, that supporting a football club is a complicated thing. And yes, for some people it will just be a case of, I live closest to this football club, therefore I will support them, and that's fine. But outside of that, by supporting them, you're also saying, I am aligning myself somewhat with what this club believes. I am aligning myself with these colours. I'm aligning myself with where this football club comes from. It's maybe a little bit different in Scotland and England, depending on where you are. But when you go to countries in Eastern Europe, when you go to countries in North Africa, Egypt in particular, if you choose to support a football club, you are making a very significant political statement, and you're making, you are literally wearing your heart on your sleeve. You're wearing the colours of the club wherever you go. And that shouldn't really be understated, that having this relationship with your football club does mean that people will perhaps look at you in a certain way. They will perhaps perceive you in a certain way and have these labels attached to you. Obviously, you being a Celtic fan, and it's funny, my dad being a Rangers fan, we obviously have this kind of banter with each other on match day, and a number of my best friends are Rangers fans as well. But there is obviously conflict attached to those two football clubs and where that derby comes from. And I would argue that saying you support either Celtic or Rangers, when someone says that to me, you then almost have this kind of list in your head that you then tick through to see what they're actually like as a person. And it's interesting that football can do that to you, because if you, for example, are supporting, like, I don't know, Montrose or even Hamilton or something like that, then you don't think like that. But then you get people mentioning certain football clubs, you're like, yes, I support them. And then you're like, right, okay, there's obviously something deeper here. And it is just interesting how certain football clubs, because of the conflict they have been formed from or found themselves a part of, make you do that when you're speaking with certain people.
I agree entirely. I'll have to put my hand up. My Scottish team is Hamilton, so I'm hoping we won't get relegated after that points deduction. But that's for another time. But let's go over to Australia, particularly the eastern side, where, and particularly in Sydney, where your football affiliation is based on your ethnicity. You've got those who have Greek origins, those who have Serbian, Croatian origins, and so on. And some of those matches have the off-field activities have been quite violent.
And very politically charged,
very political there. And you wouldn't expect that in Australia, just looking as an outsider in. But you get deeper. I remember I was over there and I used to watch Perth Glory play, who are in Western Australia. And it wasn't as bad there because there wasn't as many teams that people could align themselves to from an ethnic heritage perspective. But over in Sydney, you witnessed it all the time. And, and it's still the case now, particularly during the Yugoslav civil war. There were a lot of tensions in football in Australia at that time. I don't think the context or the country matters. I think there is always this undercurrent. And I point to Liverpool. Liverpool fans sometimes see themselves as alien to other parts of England because the way they've been treated, by the way the city's been treated by governments and so on. So there is a significant political edge to supporting Liverpool. But again, take that back. That's societal, and there's conflict aspects there as well. So it's always very nuanced. And we keep bringing these out, and people sometimes say to us, "But aren't you're going off on tangents?" But these are important tangents because they keep coming back to what everybody regards as football and war. But nothing is black and white. The First World War with football and war was not black and white. Neither was the Second World War. And again, with the Second World War, the authorities learnt their lessons from the First War and then said, right, let's use football for good. Again, footballers were conscripted. They fought alongside. And I'll give you one, out of football, something good happens. Out of football and war, something good happens. Jimmy Murphy, West Brom player, leaves his family, fights with Montgomery and the 8th Army all the way through North Africa, up into Italy, bumps into Matt Busby, who's taken a touring team over there. And by that time, Jimmy Murphy is sort of training and keeping the morale up of the troops. But they're just behind, the advancing troops. So there's a match played, and Matt Busby is really impressed with Jimmy Murphy's passion. He said, "Look, after all this finishes, which is quite soon now, I'm going to become manager of Manchester United. Do you want to join me?" And we get one of the greatest footballing partnerships. But that was the seed for the Busby Babes. That then led to, we had Munich, and then redemption at Wembley with the 68 European Cup win. But all of that started in Italy during the Second World War conflict, with both of them not exempt from undertaking military service. I would say that Jimmy Murphy had it harder than Matt Busby, because Jimmy Murphy, even though he never spoke about it, he saw a lot of bad things. You don't survive all the way to Italy without, seeing the nastiness of war, so to speak. Just to pick up on your point about peace and reconciliation, the football matches that Matt Busby with his touring team, Stan Cullis and others, some even went over to India. But what they were doing was they were either playing local teams or it was two army teams playing, but the civilian populace came to watch. And what they were saying was, look, we're friends now. We're not enemies. You're not our enemies. Your leaders were our enemies. Let's use football for peace and reconciliation. And that the populace had an escape, that they could go and watch a football and cheer. There was a match that took place in February 1945 at the International Stadium in Rome. It's the Rome Area Army Command versus a joint Lazio-Roma team. But do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
This is how football can play such a positive role in peace and reconciliation. And people don't realize that there was a lot of army football played, hundreds upon hundreds of matches played, particularly as countries were being liberated, Italy, Greece, going into Eastern Europe, playing the Czechoslovak army team and so on. right going back into Germany, into France, and then in the post-World War period, you had the British Army of the Rhine. Major footballing network was set up there as well. And again, the populace could watch these matches as well. Football was being used as a reconciliation tool, as a peace tool as well. And you can't put a price on that, because they, particularly in Germany, the populace had been so indoctrinated by that regime that a new doctrine had to be given to them. And football was used as a tool for that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because then you look to the examples of Yugoslavia again, and how, especially in Kosovo, football programs have risen to take children from different ethnicities, different backgrounds, and different nationalities to play with each other, taking them out of situations and circumstances where they would be told that these children are their enemies and that these children don't deserve to exist, and actually giving them a route to build those bridges, understand one another, and promote peace. And it's the same in Scotland, and it sounds wild, and I'm not trying to compare Scotland and Yugoslavia by any means, but we have these programs in schools to try and, oppose isn't the right word, but you know what I mean, to try and stamp out sectarianism, so that we're teaching children that, this person who wears green or this person who wears blue isn't someone that you have to naturally see as an enemy. These are people that will be your friends. Do you know what I mean? And it's again, though, it's doing it through football, which I find fascinating, because with anything else, you could just take these kids and sit them down in a room and just speak at them for 40 minutes. Do you know what I mean? But they use football because it's such a team sport, and, because it relies on teamwork and working with one another and communicating with one another. They could use any other sport, but they choose football, and that's what I find quite fascinating about it. It's just always played this role. It's always been central, and it will continue to be central in these peace-building processes.
I agree entirely, and I've been really fortunate. As I said, I was involved with the Kick Racism Out of Football campaign in England, but also Show Racism the Red Card, which was your campaign in Scotland. Again, I worked with colleagues there as well, in terms of evaluating and helping them to evaluate the work they were doing. But football is universal.
Yes.
There's a famous story, you could drop Pele anywhere or Bobby Charlton anywhere in the world, and they would be instantly recognizable. Now it's Messi and Ronaldo.
Yep.
And irrespective of what you think of these players as individuals, if they are utilized for peaceful purposes, in any aspect of conflict, they will have a positive impact, because they are universally loved for their skill, the way they play and so on. But, they're people, and particularly young people, are drawn to them.
Yeah.
But they're not political figures.
No.
You see, this is interesting. Pele wasn't political. Bobby Charlton wasn't political. And Bobby Charlton, he was a national serviceman.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting facts I like to throw in every now and again is that the England team that won the 1966 World Cup, a significant number of them were national servicemen or had done national service. And the manager, Sir Alf Ramsey, served in the Second World War. So you can't get away from it. Even the England World Cup winning team, there is always a link somewhere. And but again, it can be used for good as well. And look at the good work that Stanley Matthews, Bobby Charlton, and Pele have done throughout the world in terms of going to, a war in South America stopped allegedly when Pele was in town, and it could only happen because of who they are.
I totally agree. It could only have happened because of their stature as well. And I think just to finish up on the point that you came back about tangents, is that, people will always say, oh, well, this is a tangent, this isn't really related, or the link is really loose. So why is it falling in a part of like what you're trying to do? For example, yourselves, football and war, or for us, football and heritage and whatever. And it's like, well, they're not really tangents, so it's context. And context is important, because we can't operate in the way that we do without context. We don't, some of us do react to just the situations, but you need to know the context to be able to understand what we're talking about, or what it is you're looking to do. And just because, it's to me, a tangent is just that context. Do you know what I mean? And I would say to anyone who's maybe thinking, oh, well, does this really fall within these brackets, is to just have a think about the context that people provide in terms of, to help you understand, but also the history of whatever it is that they're talking about, because it'll likely fit in there one way or another. And for me, I mean, anyway, I've been open about this before. If there is a link, however tenuous, I will go for it and I will use it, because, it's something to talk about and it's interesting to discuss these things. It's interesting to look at the different things that surround your subject area or what it is you're trying to talk about. So, context, whenever we're discussing these things, is really, really important. But Alex, this has been a brilliant chat. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we've got for this discussion today. I have no doubt that we'll get you back on the show to talk about other things to do with football and war and conflict. Is there anything else that you want to add just before we finish up for today?
I do indeed, and it's picking up on the point you make. We have a significant theme around women's football from the early 20th century to the current day, and the issues that women's football still encounter now have their context and their foundation in how women and women's football were treated in the early part of the 20th century.
It's true.
And we keep making those connections. And with the work we've done in schools and the exhibitions we've been involved in, it keeps coming back to that. Suddenly, young people and others make the connection that there is still a lot of work to do, even though we've gone over 1.25 centuries of trying to deal with these issues, that they still remain. So, there are no tangents. Context is key here.
100%. Yeah, no, that's really important as well. Whether it's the study of women's football teams during this period of time, or into the modern day, or I've said it on this show before, just whatever football club it is you support, go and have a look at the history. Go and have a look at the people involved in the club and what their views were, what conflicts they were involved in, what side they were fighting on, because I can guarantee you'll find out something that you didn't know about your football club. But it will hopefully also give you a better idea of where your club comes from, why you support them, why you choose to support them, maybe even where you and your family come from as well. It's certainly what I found out. It's what other people that I know have found out. And it's something that can just enrich your experience as a football fan as well. Alex, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you this morning. Of course, if anyone else wants to come on the show, then you can get in touch with us. If you want to write for our blog, you can get in touch with us. If you want to write for the Football and War Network as well, then you can get in touch with them. We'll put all the details to get in touch with them on the show notes for this episode. But if you want to get in touch with us, you can DM us an X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. Thank you once again to all of our listeners who tuned in for this episode, but that'll do us for today. So Alex, say goodbye.
Bye-bye, and thank you very much for the opportunity to have this fascinating conversation with you.
Yeah, it's been a really good chat. Thanks very much for coming on, mate. It's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.